Hurricane Katrina changed America forever, and the man who led the rescue says we still haven't learned. Lieutenant General Russell Honore became a household name in 2005 when he commanded Joint Task Force Katrina, leading recovery efforts in one of the deadliest disasters in U.S. history. Now, as the nation marks the 20th anniversary of the catastrophe, Honore delivers a chilling warning: the same failures that killed nearly 1,400 people are happening again. As storms grow stronger and climate disasters multiply, the lessons of Katrina remain dangerously ignored. Local leaders still fail, warnings come too late, and the most vulnerable are still left behind. So what exactly happened during those chaotic days in New Orleans? And why does Honore believe we're doomed to repeat the same deadly mistakes? To understand the magnitude of this disaster, we need to go back to August 29, 2005. Hurricane Katrina made landfall as a Category 3 storm with winds of 125 miles per hour, but it wasn't just the wind that killed.
Causing Gulf waters to rush in, flooding 80% of the city, leaving so many stranded.
I'm very glad to be getting right here. I thank Jesus to be getting right here.
New Orleans, a vibrant city, is now a ghost town. It looks like something out of a doomsday scenario.
Hurricane Katrina slamming into the Louisiana shoreline on August 29, 2005. A Category 5 in the open Gulf before weakening to a Category 3 at landfall with winds of 125 miles per hour. The natural disaster turning man-made after dozens of flood walls were breached, with multiple investigations finding the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was responsible for the infrastructure failure. That's the federal organization that built the protective barriers. As water levels quickly rose, residents were...
The real catastrophe unfolded when the levees broke, a failure that would later be blamed on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Within hours, 80% of New Orleans was underwater, with some areas submerged in up to 15 feet of murky, contaminated water. More than 240,000 homes were destroyed. Entire neighborhoods that had stood for generations vanished beneath the flood. The vibrant city transformed into what survivors described as a ghost town, a doomsday scenario that seemed impossible in modern America. But the most haunting images weren't of destroyed buildings. They were of people trapped on rooftops.
And we were at places where we couldn't leave her by herself. So my wife, who also worked at the station, couldn't work. If anyone was going to work, it was going to be me. And I had to leave, and it was, every time I would leave, it was traumatic because, you know, we had gone through this traumatic thing.
Katrina's 145-mile-an-hour winds bearing down on the Gulf Coast early this morning. New Orleans, braced for a direct hit, is instead weathering a storm far less powerful than had been predicted. Still, the city and surrounding region is by no means getting off scot-free. At the Superdome, 10,000 locals are biding their time as the storm roars all around them outside. Inside, insufficient powers left them with no air conditioning. These next few hours here will be tense ones. Katrina may not be hitting as hard as she could have, but she's doing plenty of damage. Inside New Orleans downtown, we're finding out that a levee has been breached, apparently. Water starting to rise in areas that were dry overnight, so that's a huge problem. This city, or what's left of it, underwater and under siege. Lake Pontchartrain, which sits to the north, has overtaken downtown. Lake water's poured in through two massive levee breaks into...
Coast Guard helicopters worked around the clock, pulling desperate residents from their homes as water levels continued to rise. Rescue crews would eventually save more than 33,000 people in one of the largest rescue operations in American history. The scenes were almost too overwhelming to count. Families waving makeshift flags, elderly residents clinging to whatever they could find, children crying as they waited for help that seemed impossibly slow to arrive. When Honore flew into New Orleans by helicopter on August 31, 2005, he witnessed scenes that still break his heart today. Thousands of residents had gathered at the Superdome, one of the city's designated evacuation centers. But this wasn't salvation. It became a symbol of everything that went wrong.
people, but so many others killed in the extreme flooding, the death toll soaring to nearly 1,400. Meanwhile, 26,000 people sought shelter at the Superdome, which sustained substantial damage during the storm. In the aftermath, victims were forced to wait for aid, leading to widespread looting, with some victims stealing food and water from shuttered storefronts. In total, 1.5 million people were displaced by the hurricane, with 40% of those never to return home. Katrina causing $125 billion in damages, making it the costliest storm in U.S. history. And while the levees have been rebuilt, the scars from this catastrophe still run deep.
Max de Paris, thank you for
The stadium's roof was damaged, letting in rain and heat. Power had failed, leaving people in darkness. The plumbing had stopped working, creating unsanitary conditions that grew worse by the hour. At its peak, more than 26,000 people were crammed inside, waiting for buses that wouldn't come for days. The conditions inside were beyond description. It was a humanitarian nightmare.
Windows, getting the air moving to help the canines pick up the gruesome scents and the location of the victims. They're also responsible for making sure the structures are safe to search in this hard-hit area. For New Orleans firefighters, it's a very personal, grim task.
I was born and raised in the 9th Ward. I went to high school at Holy Cross, and I'm from this area.
Given the proximity of these homes here to the levee breach right back there, you can understand why the rushing floodwater some 14 feet high did so much damage. Now, some of the homes like this one still standing, but if you cross the street and you check out this home over here, a couple of them actually, they're simply piles of rubble, making it very difficult for the search and rescue teams to access any victims that may still be there. It is why they fear that even after their mission is complete, more victims may still remain in this neighborhood. Flooded twice, first by Katrina, then by Rita. Over the past 2 weeks, at least 45 bodies were discovered. And until they're done searching and decontaminating, no residents will be allowed back to salvage what they can.
We're trying to save them from coming back here themselves and finding their loved ones.
For the last 2 weeks, Louis Orduna Jr. has been handing out these flyers, trying to find his father who stayed through the storm. Now that the water's gone down in his neighborhood, he decided to go home.
This is the way you gotta do it. This is the way you gotta do it.
His house in Lakeview has been underwater for several weeks, and today he's going in for the first time.
Cause I was born and raised here. I was born in this house.
Orduna lives there with his 90-year-old father, who's been missing since the storm.
He wouldn't evacuate because he wasn't going to go nowhere without his little dog.
Today he's hoping to salvage whatever the water hasn't destroyed.
Every childhood memory, pictures.
Survivors recall receiving only a small muffin and 1 bottle of water per day. The stench became so overwhelming that many people chose to camp outside just to breathe. Reports of violence spread through the crowd, including shootings and assaults. Medical emergencies went untreated. The elderly and infirm suffered in the heat without their medications. What was supposed to be a refuge had become a prison, and the world watched in horror as one of America's great cities descended into chaos. The general recalls seeing a woman pushing a toddler in a shopping basket through floodwater that reached the baby's chest. She was desperately trying to reach the Superdome to save her child and herself. That image crystallized everything wrong with the response. People without resources, abandoned by their government, fighting for survival in the richest nation on earth. But the tragedy didn't start when the levees broke. It began with decisions made long before the storm arrived. Forecasters had warned of catastrophe if people failed to evacuate. They knew what was coming. Yet New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin didn't issue a mandatory evacuation order until August 28th, just 1 day before landfall. That delay proved fatal. Roughly 20% of the local population stayed behind, most of them poor and elderly. These weren't people making reckless choices. They were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The stories of those who stayed behind are heartbreaking. Many elderly residents knew where their medications were and had lived alone for years. They wanted to stay in familiar surroundings.
It's scary. I felt it was very ill-planned. There was murder, there was suicide. It was just the conditions, it was so horrible that I had to get out.
There are 6 bodies upstairs on the 3rd floor. This morning I found one lady in a wheelchair dead in the ladies' bathroom and another lady laying on the floor by the ladies' bathroom dead.
It is really broken. It is really broken and it's tough. And I'm very glad to be getting right here. I thank Jesus to be getting right here.
Yeah. Hang on a second. I mean, this is America. Oh, this is the richest country in the world.
Not anymore. I mean, you see the richest country in the world is going to up to the rich people. This ain't for the poor. This is what's going on. This is poor people here.
But President Bush says this is the biggest relief operation in American history.
It ain't over here. You see it? You hear? What you go right around your vehicle, you ain't gonna find no relief going on here. It's a joke. It's a government joke. That's where our tax money went. Ain't no relief here, man.
Progress in the city, power restored in some places in Metairie tonight, but that should be no invitation, they say, for folks to come back into the area just yet, because there is so much more work to be done in this area, in the city, in Jefferson Parish, all around this area, where folks can't come back just yet because there still is so much work to be done.
This was unprecedented. There was no plan. It wasn't like the national government had a plan for if a hurricane hits the city of New Orleans and the levee breaks, we need to have a plan. There wasn't anything like that. It didn't exist. And so when you can say, yeah, should the government have done more? Probably, but I think they just didn't know what to do.
This administration is not going to rest until every life can be saved, until families are reconnected, until this recovery is complete. I want to make sure those poor folks who've been taken out of their communities get the help they need. We're making progress about pulling the people out of the Superdome.
One man, 90 years old and a World War II veteran, refused to leave his home despite his son's pleas. When the waters rose, he tried to reach the door but never made it. His son would later find his body, still clutching his military medals, a final, desperate attempt to preserve his dignity even in death. When the city finally sent people to pick them up, the system failed them again. You couldn't take animals in ambulances, and elderly people refused to leave without their pets. It took Hurricane Katrina to change federal law to include shelter for pets, a basic humanity that should have been obvious. The storm revealed how deeply inequality was embedded in disaster planning. The wealthy had cars and credit cards to evacuate. The poor had neither. The result was predictable and preventable mass casualties. When the levees failed, state officials prioritized evacuation, food, and water. But logistical challenges mounted quickly. People were desperate for basic essentials, and the government response was woefully inadequate. Reports of lawlessness spread through the media, but Honoré says most of what was called looting was actually survival. People were taking water, food, and diapers, not luxury items. Some were breaking into shuttered storefronts just to find something to keep their children alive. The general criticized how law enforcement responded, saying there was a built-in cultural assumption that poor people would loot. Some adjacent parishes and municipalities actually blocked evacuees from entering their areas, claiming these desperate people would come to steal. This wasn't just callousness, it was systemic racism that turned disaster victims into criminals in the public mind. The local, state, and federal response to Hurricane Katrina was widely criticized, and rightfully so. As Honoré put it, the storm overmatched the infrastructure and overmatched the government's ability to deal with it. But here's the terrifying part. We knew this would happen. In 2004, a year before Katrina, FEMA funded a disaster simulation exercise called Hurricane PAM. It looked at what would happen if a slow-moving Category 3 hurricane hit New Orleans. The simulation predicted thousands of deaths and that the entire city would be flooded. The warnings were there, the science was clear, but when the actual presentation was made, federal agencies didn't seem to recognize the seriousness of the region's vulnerability. Some federal officials were literally laughing in the back of the room during the briefing. One expert recalls feeling like he was just the geek with a strange accent that nobody took seriously. This wasn't ignorance, it was willful denial of scientific evidence that could have saved lives. 20 years later, as we mark this grim anniversary, Honoré remains an active crisis consultant. He's advised on flooding, wildfires, and even the security failures of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. His message is consistent. We're making the same mistakes that killed people in New Orleans. Climate change is making storms stronger and more frequent. Sea levels are rising. Extreme weather events are becoming the norm, not the exception. Yet our disaster preparedness hasn't fundamentally changed. We still have the same inequality, the same systemic failures, the same willingness to abandon the most vulnerable when crisis strikes. The 2025 hurricane season has already begun, and experts warn it could be one of the most active on record. Communities across the Gulf Coast and Atlantic seaboard face the same vulnerabilities that devastated New Orleans. Poor communities still lack evacuation resources. Infrastructure is still crumbling. Emergency management is still underfunded and politically driven. Recent disasters prove Honoré's point.
On August 24, 2005, at 10:30 p.m., Hurricane Katrina made its first landfall in southeast Florida as a Category 1 storm.
Many Miami area residents feel they were sucker punched by Katrina.
Moving into the warm waters of the Gulf, Katrina rapidly intensified.
That's perfect conditions for a hurricane to strengthen.
On August 27th, as Katrina closed in on New Orleans, Mayor Ray Nagin first issued a voluntary evacuation warning.
This is a once in probably a lifetime event.
Upgrading that warning to the city's first ever mandatory evacuation order the next day. Just 19 hours before landfall. Hurricane Katrina, now a Category 5 storm with maximum sustained winds of 175 miles per hour. For those with nowhere to go and no way to get out, the Superdome was opened as a refuge of last resort. Roughly 15,000 people poured in. At 6:10 a.m. on August 29th, Hurricane Katrina made landfall near Bearis, Louisiana, as a weakened Category 3. A last-minute shift sparing New Orleans from a direct hit. Still, power was knocked out almost immediately. The wind roaring. By the evening news, reports that the Big Easy seemed to have averted a doomsday scenario.
By late this evening, onlookers were back in the French Quarter. In the words of one, the fact that the damage wasn't worse was pure New Orleans luck.
But out of sight of the cameras stationed at the Superdome and in the French Quarter, a horrific tragedy already unfolding. Before, after, and during landfall, levees built to hold back storm surge failed catastrophically. Multiple breaches sending water almost 20 feet high, surging into the lower Ninth Ward and several other neighborhoods. Later reports finding those levee failures were due largely to engineering errors. On August 30th, the severity of the disaster seen widely for the first time. Heartbreaking images of people climbing onto roofs to escape the rising water, rescued by firefighters and volunteers on boats, and the Coast Guard in helicopters. Others wading through the dark, murky waters. The rescue operation would take days. Images of desperation, people waving for help from rooftops, now burned into the American psyche. Many of them poor, many of them black. Those rescued brought to an already crowded Superdome, once a refuge, now a hellscape.
What was it like in the Superdome and why did you leave?
It was horrible. We couldn't sleep at night. Sanitary was nasty. The food was horrible. You understand what I'm saying? My children, it's a nightmare. We probably lost everything. But you think these people care? The mayor don't even care.
Others waited on highways and bridges to be evacuated in the relentless sun's scorching heat. Thousands more sought shelter at the convention center down the road.
No food, no water, no nothing. Whatever we had, we've been taking it.
This is a shirt I'm making for my baby because I don't have no clothes. And he all dirty. He just 2 months. 2 months.
I got to tell you from the bottom of my heart how sad I feel for those people. The federal government just learned about those people today, and I've got to tell you, we are moving heaven and earth.
As desperation grew, people breaking into stores, grabbing food, clean clothes and shoes. Amid reports of lawlessness, the governor mobilizing the National Guard.
I have one message for these hoodlums. These troops know how to shoot and kill, and they are more than willing to do so if necessary, and I expect they will.
On September 1st, the National Guard relief mission arrived with food. On September 3rd, 5 days after Hurricane Katrina made landfall, buses and then planes ramped up evacuation efforts, dispersing survivors to cities all across the country. It would take weeks and months to understand Hurricane Katrina's deadly toll. More than 1,300 people killed, many of them the elderly or the sick. In all, more than 1 million people were displaced from the Gulf Coast. Those who came back, finding what they had worked for their entire lives, destroyed. The costliest hurricane in American history. Priscilla Thompson, NBC News.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.
In Texas, devastating floods continue to claim lives, including young children at summer camps who died following instructions to stay put rather than seek higher ground. Parents have testified before state officials, demanding changes after their 11-year-old daughters and grandparents perished in preventable tragedies. The lack of warning systems, weather radios, and proper evacuation plans echoes the same failures from Katrina 2 decades ago. The Trump administration has made major cuts to FEMA, which is critically important for preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disasters. The President and Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem have repeatedly talked about getting rid of FEMA entirely. The agency's acting administrator was actually fired after saying he didn't believe it was in the best interests of the American people to eliminate FEMA. This political interference is crippling national disaster preparedness capacity at the exact moment when climate disasters are becoming more frequent and severe. We're officially in hurricane season now. Wildfires are already burning in several western states. Severe flooding has devastated communities from West Texas to North Carolina. Many more disasters are coming. It's just a question of where and when. Yet instead of strengthening our disaster response capabilities, we're weakening them for political reasons. This isn't just policy failure, it's moral failure. The lessons of Hurricane Katrina aren't complex or controversial. Evacuate people early. Don't abandon the poor and elderly. Coordinate federal, state, and local responses. Treat disaster victims with humanity, not suspicion. Plan for the storms we know are coming, not the ones we hope won't happen. But learning these lessons requires admitting that our society systematically fails its most vulnerable members. It requires acknowledging that disaster response is often shaped more by prejudice than preparedness. It requires political leaders to prioritize science over politics and human life over ideology. Honoré's warning isn't just about hurricanes, it's about who we are as a society. When crisis strikes, do we come together or turn against each other? Do we protect the vulnerable or abandon them? Do we learn from our mistakes or repeat them with deadly consequences? The next major hurricane will test these questions again. Somewhere along the Gulf Coast or Atlantic seaboard, another storm is building. Another community will face the choice between evacuation and staying behind. Another group of officials will decide whether to heed warnings or ignore them. Another population of poor and elderly residents will depend on systems that have already failed them before. Hurricane Katrina killed nearly 1,400 people and caused over $200 billion in damage. It displaced 1.5 million residents, with 40% never returning home. 20 years later, New Orleans is still recovering, still rebuilding, still grappling with the trauma of that August morning when the levees broke. The scars from this catastrophe run deep, visible in every rebuilt neighborhood and empty lot where homes once stood. The survivors deserve better than thoughts and prayers on anniversaries. They deserve a commitment that will never let this happen again. They deserve emergency management systems that work for everyone, not just those wealthy enough to evacuate on their own. They deserve leaders who listen to scientists, plan for the future, and treat all citizens with equal dignity in times of crisis. But if General Honoré is right, and his track record suggests he is, we're not learning these lessons fast enough. The next Hurricane Katrina is coming, and we're still not ready. The question isn't whether another major disaster will strike. It's whether we'll finally be prepared when it does. The clock is ticking, the storms are strengthening, and the most vulnerable among us are still waiting for a government that won't abandon them when the waters rise. Hurricane Katrina's 20th anniversary should be more than remembrance. It should be a wake-up call, because if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And next time, the death toll could be even higher.